Welcome to another episode of the Divine Counsel Worldview Podcast. Thank you, Mike, for joining me again. And today we will be covering Genesis 15, and especially that famous phrase, Abraham believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to Abram as righteousness. So, well, Mike, Dr. Heiser introduced, and I think he coined this phrase. I didn't see it anywhere besides his works, the phrase believing loyalty when he was defining faith at one point. I think it's even in his book, The Unseen Realm. We had Matthew Bates on for an interview a bit ago, and he had a book that, again, sent shockwaves through the evangelical world called Salvation by Allegiance Alone. I've had conversations with my Reformed friends over that book, and they didn't like it. Why do you think, Mike, as an opening, question, unrehearsed here, why is the idea of allegiance or loyalty shocking to many evangelicals, do you think? And this is I don't have an answer. I'm just wondering what you think so we can start down this path of Genesis 15:6 today.
I think my suspicion is that it has a lot to do with popular, not even evangelical, but just popular American definitions of the word faith, right? Where years ago, my pastor did a sermon series about what is faith and other religious terms. And one of the things I realized through that was that from a very secular kind of perspective, the word faith has been diluted to the point of almost a positive attitude. Like, I hope I will get that job. I have faith that I will do well in my exam. I have faith that I will land the promotion that I want. I have faith that my startup will actually survive for the next year. And the word is used in a way of almost like, I hope. It's almost like a synonym
with a positive mental energy behind the hope. Yeah.
Yeah. And for us, even within the evangelical church in America, I have, in some sense, there's a sadness to me that it seems like we are heading towards something like that as well, but just with a little bit more spiritual overtones, but still of like, I have faith that God will give us children. I have faith that our church will grow tenfold. I have faith, and it's really a dilution of something that is really meant to be a very provocative term.
Yeah,
and I
the
think
meaning of faith is tough. I mean, I pulled off my shelf in preparation for this the old, and I had this in Bible college, Basic Theology by Charles Ryrie. You can still buy, the Ryrie Study Bible today. And the meaning of faith, he's got 3 sentences. Faith means confidence, trust, to hold something as true. Of course, faith must have content. There must be confidence or trust about something. And then he turns it into a religious meaning. To have faith in Christ unto salvation means to have confidence that he can remove the guilt of sin and grant eternal life. He then, just very quick, he says, well, there's other kinds of faith, intellectual, historical faith, miracle faith, which kind of gets into your point about I have faith that I'll have a child or something, or my startup will work. This is faith to perform something that may not be accompanied by salvation itself. Temporary faith. Then he has even a separate concept called saving faith. This is a reliance on the truth of the gospel as revealed in the word of God. I would even, bless Dr. Ryrie, his memory, I would still say that there he is Christianizing a term that may be over the top for me. In other words, it sounds almost like he's saying faith in the salvational sense is having a belief in a certain soteriological promise that Jesus will do such and such. And so there I'm even putting my faith in a concept of what Jesus said was true and so forth, which, well, here's what we're going to do in Genesis 15. And Mike had believing loyalty as a phrase. Matthew Bates has allegiance as a word. I've often just thought of the term loyalty, that the concept of what God, and here's the verse. Well, you know what? Let's do this. I think it's fair to our audience to just start reading Genesis 15 and get to our verse that we're going to be talking about when it comes to the meaning of faith. After these things, this is Genesis 15, the story of 14, of course, where Abram defeats the kings of the nations and gains back Lot and so forth and meets Melchizedek. We don't know how much time passes. Well, actually, we do. It's within about 10 years because we're going to find that Abram is coming up to the promise of his son and so forth, and we're going to be able to date something. So it's within the same time period. After these things, 15:1, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your exceedingly great reward." Now, again, don't be bothered by the word reward. Our soteriology is often, made nervous by that word. It just means what you get in exchange for something. A wage is the same term in Hebrew used here. So God is saying, I'm the one that you're getting in our loyalty covenant. I'm being loyal to you. You're being loyal to me. That's what I'm going to argue for here. And what you're getting out of this is me, not a promise of any certain things or even possessions or whatever, but it's me. Abram said, Lord God, and again, you can see the story kind of developing based on Abram's humanity. He's going to think normal thoughts. Lord God, what will you give me, seeing I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? In other words, my heir is not my son, it's one of my hired servants. Mm-hmm. Then Abram said, look, you have given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, probably in another vision, saying, well, actually, he took him outside. So my guess would be a malach, some kind of a messenger came to him and said these things to him. This one shall not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body shall be your heir. And he brought him outside. So this being brings Abraham out of his tent. And this doesn't happen very often where I live because of the city lights around Minneapolis, but every now and then you get to a place where you have a clear blue, well, at night, starry sky without lights. And I'm sure this is how it looked for Abram that night. Now look toward heaven and count the stars if you are able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. By the way, there's fun discussion, Mike, you've probably seen this among Divine Council Worldview people, that this is not just a quantitative promise, but a qualitative promise, because the stars were where the divine beings lived. And so to equate stars and gods together, or as similar connotations anyway, has drawn a lot of conversation with maybe what God was promising Abraham here was beyond just the numbers, although he does mention the number, so it's probably the emphasis. But could it also have a emphasis on, or at least a connotation, that the quality of your descendants will be as the stars, which would be what we'll, in a theology class call theosis, or divine participation, and that sort of thing. So I'm sure you've heard of all that, and
or glorification.
Give me a comment on that part of it.
Yeah, or glorification, as some Reformed theologians would call it.
It's possible that it's there, but at least at this point, we're talking numbers, and we can keep moving from here. But here comes the really, now this is an operative verse in the sense that, the New Testament uses the Old Testament in many different ways, sometimes direct quotation. And this will be one of those verses that at least three times, Romans 4:3, Galatians 3:6, and James 2:23, the Bible, the New Testament author will pick up a verse out of the Old Testament literally and drop it into his New Testament context. And here comes the verse. And I would love to hear different, and I just don't have the room in front of me to put all the different versions up here, but there's different ways of interpreting this or translating it. And here's how my new King James reads. And he, Abram, believed in the Lord, and he, that's Yahweh then, accounted it to him, Abraham, for righteousness. The operative words there, of course, besides Yahweh, he's mentioned there, is aman, which is the Hebrew word behind believed, and tzedekah, which is behind the word righteousness. But for the sake of our discussion, really within this podcast, I think we have enough to do. Let me give you my opinion on righteousness, but then I need to move on or move back to the concept of believe. Righteousness is often, I just picked up a book, in fact, by an author, I won't say his name, at a half-price books, and it's a primer on righteousness, or justification, really, it's the same word. And I even wrote in the flyleaf, I sometimes make bet with myself, Mike. I will write in the flyleaf or the beginning pages of a book where I think an author will go based on what I have read of him in the past. And I'll predict that he'll do this and he'll do this and he'll say this and he'll avoid this. I just play this game with myself so that when I finally have the chance to read the book, which I did have a chance. My wife was out of town for half a day, so I went to an IHOP and ordered pancakes and just read. And what a glorious time that was for me to get away. And that's my favorite thing to do, sit at a stack of pancakes and read. And I made this little bet with myself that the author would, and I was right. I was so, in a sense, proud of myself, but sad too, that the author took a version of righteousness, which, here it is, was completely judicial. He just said, when you see the word righteousness in your Bible, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said it is a judicial term and it means to be made right in the courtroom of God's judicial dealings. And so, of course, he went right to Paul, the Apostle Paul, and played out the Pauline doctrine of justification as he saw it. And he unfortunately spent, and I predicted this in the title of the book, that he would not go to the Old Testament for any of his dealings with righteousness. I just predicted it, because if you do that, here's my point, you're going to find a word, tzedekah, that is extremely non-judicial. It is very much involved in average day-to-day dealings between people, between items, to have a righteous wheel or a justified wagon wheel will be to fix the wheel. In other words, justification, when I see the word, here's my point, when you see the word righteousness in 15:6, don't think a courtroom scene. All you have to do is say to yourself, God accounted it to him as proper, right. He was proper. He was what God wanted him to be. And I'll let that argument go for now. But I want to give you a chance to talk back too, Mike. Anything so far? The concept of righteousness, here's my point, is not judicial. And I get nervous, if not frustrated, when I hear people constantly appealing to the judicial nature of the word.
I think you might be onto something, because as you were talking, I'm looking up in the dictionary of the Old Testament, like on the word for righteousness, or sadiq.
Yeah.
Interesting. They have a little moment where they mention about Ugaritic and West Semitic languages of the approximate equivalent of this word from Hebrew. And one of the things they mentioned was that in Aramaic inscriptions, it generally exhibits the semantic nuance of loyalty. And then further, they say, all these examples deal with the notion of loyalty within a vassal relationship. So essentially like a high king to his governor, his vassal, ruler under him, that there is this sense of loyalty. And so there's not even a sense of judicialness. It's simply
right.
like you got my back, right? And I have your back. We're going to be loyal because we're loyal to one another, because we're in this very clear relationship where loyalty is what really matters. Because if things hit the fan, I need to know that you have my back, and likewise the other way. Yeah.
And so, and boy, there's so many things we could do here, but because this is a Divine Counsel podcast, I don't want to center on a theological discussion that could go down a path that just divides the crowd between Reformed and Arminian, right? I mean, that's kind of where this could go. And I realize that. So back in, is it 2006-ish or so, N.T. Wright and John Piper were scheduled to have a debate at ETS on the meaning of righteousness, and Dr. Piper was on a sabbatical, so two others stepped into his place, and there was a three-way conversation there at ETS, and it was fun, just fun. I sat in the front row, and my question was the first one asked when they did all the questions at the end, and it was, how would you define becoming a Christian? Because I wanted to hear how these bigwigs defined the very question that we're all sitting there wondering, how do I get righteous? So I was very proud to myself that I leaned over to my wife and said, that's my question. But the point being, righteousness can be a very heady discussion. It's extremely practical, frankly, because you're asking, how do you get right with God? And then that, opens up a huge discussion, obviously. It's Soteriology 101. But our discussion here, for sake of this podcast, I would like to get back to that word believed, which is aman in Hebrew, commonly translated, obviously, as believe. But here's what I'd like to do. If you're able to get to a Bible, I'm going to page 4 times into other uses of the word aman. Now, it's often believed, so don't think that I'm just going to, my 4 favorite passages, as much as saying, you see the word believe in your New Testament, your Old Testament. It's probably the word aman behind it. But I want to show you other places where that same word aman in Hebrew shows up unexpectedly. Genesis 42:20. In fact, it's fun to take people to a verse like this and say, can you find the word aman in it, and see what they come up with. I did this in our Sunday school class the other day. At church, 42:20, and bring your youngest brother to me, Joseph saying, so your words will be verified and you shall not die. And they did so. The word aman is the word verified there. And so however your text goes, so your words will be aman. There's something about that word that's deep enough, heady enough, meaningful enough that the translator of my New King James can put the word verified there. Jump in, Mike, if you have a version that might be different. Numbers 11, verse 12. Mm-hmm. So Moses said to the Lord, 11:12. Did I conceive all these people, God said, did I beget them? Or Moses saying, that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a guardian carries a nursing child to the land which you swore to their fathers. The word guardian there is aman. You know how English can noun verbs? Same way with Hebrew, it can noun verbs. And the verb aman here stands as guardian or nursing mother. Fantastic word picture, is it not? That a use of aman can mean nursing mother. In other words, what I would do with a group that I'm doing this with, I would say, what common theme is coming out of this word aman that allows it to be translated literally into words like nursing mother?
There's another one here. 1 Samuel 3:20.
Yep, I'm getting to that one. Coming up to it. Yeah, since you're there, what is it?
ESV, it has it as, and all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of Yahweh. And
the word established is the verb aman. Fantastic. Numbers 11:12. Or 12:7. Numbers 12:7. There we go. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. Now we're getting close. The word faithful there is the actual word aman. One of my favorites is Deuteronomy 7:9. Therefore know that the Lord your God, he is God, the faithful God, who keeps covenant and mercy for 1,000 generations with those who love him and keep his commandments. And again, faithful, it's not hard to find it in that verse, but think of how meaningful that word would be to the first-time listener, where the gods, again, in the ancient world are notoriously hard to pin down. You never knew what your God would do the next day. I have a Muslim friend, and he admits Allah is unknown when it comes to the next morning. You never know what Allah will do. That's why you have to respect him and do your 5 prayers a day, because you never know. Well, listen to how this would have sounded to the average hearer. Therefore know that Yahweh, your Elohim, he is an aman Elohim. That powerful stuff to that world, and I'd recommend it would have made, again, the average person who was hearing about Yahweh when he was a minority deity there in Canaan, perk up their ears and say, what? He's a aman Elohim? I've never heard of one of them. And then one more, and again, you were close with it. I have another one in Samuel, 1 Samuel 2:35. Then I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart, and in my mind I will build him a sure house. And again, just the word faithful is the actual, or just the straightforward word aman. Now, if you take the word aman, and Hebrew does this a lot, you verb nouns, noun verbs, you can also turn a verb into an adjective by just giving it different vowels. So aman, the verb, amunah, the adjective. If you look that up in a Hebrew dictionary and use in the Old Testament, it's almost always faithful. Amunah just means faithful. And so here's my burden, Mike. And I don't know how else to express this, obviously to our audience, but I'm talking to you. So I'm going to complain to you. How's that? How did American evangelicalism come to the place where faith and faithfulness almost mean the opposite thing in English? Isn't that stunning? Because you mentioned early on that faith in your background and in just how you hear the word, it has this kind of a positive mental attitude issue, whatever. Faithfulness means like I'm sticking with something. Through thick and thin, I'm gonna stay with something. I'm faithful to my Vikings even when they're bad. That's how we use the. Are you still faithful to the Patriots, or are you a Tom Brady fan?
No. Well, to both.
Okay. I'm a Kirk Cousins fan, and he just got, he's signed with Atlanta, but I like him. He's a good Christian man. I just like the guy. So I'm rooting for Kirk Cousins, even though I'm faithful. I'm amunah to Kirk Cousins in a different jersey. Yet my faithfulness still sticks with the purple and gold. So if Kirk Cousins played the Vikings, guess what I'm going for? I'm going for my jersey, right? That's how immature I am. But my point is that faithfulness has a deep meaning to it in English. We talk about being faithful to our wife. It's a simple idea, Mike, is coming home to the right house at night sometimes. It just means sticking with that person through thick and thin, okay? When we go to a wedding and we hear a couple give their vows, promising the moon, basically, we don't turn to our friend and say, they'll never do it. They'll never do it. I know they can't do that. We know what they mean. We have a sense that faithfulness means for that couple standing up there, they are promising their fidelity when it comes to where they're going to go home at night. That's what they mean. And we hold them to it. We don't also lean over and say they can't because they're depraved, or they can't because that's going to take special grace. We say, in our mind, the story of human fidelity simply means I choose between options and I have the ability to make the right choice. We do it all the time. And here's my burden. Again, I'm giving you more than you have time to respond to, Mike. But for some reason in the evangelical tradition, when we talk about faithfulness to a deity, we start saying, well, we're depraved. Well, we can't do it unless God is gracious and brings us to faith. Or we start talking in terms of inability. That's our creeds. To the point where we take the biblical story of, here we go, Genesis 15:6. A guy is said in the text to simply become aman to a deity, and that deity responds by saying, you're right. Very simple paradigm, but oh so powerful. And here's my problem, and now I'm going to be quiet and let you talk. We take that whole concept and we turn it inside out, it feels like, in American evangelicalism. And we say, well, faith, this means this, and you can't do it unless God does this. And we just change that story out so differently by the time you get to a Pauline justification doctrine. It seems to me. So I've said enough, but what do you think?
I mean, a part of me speculates, and I wonder if this is more indicative of the fact that our culture in America is very fickle, right? And because even when you ask me the question of like, am I still faithful to my Pats or to Tom Brady? Like that's a typical question. That's normally asked, right? It's this almost assumption that our loyalties can easily be swayed and can easily jump from one brand to another, right? I used to be a Coca-Cola guy. Now I'm Pepsi. And now I'm back to Coca-Cola. Now I'm into some sort of like, offshoot brand that is like independent or something. I think our culture is still very much into the sense of we don't want to be tied down to one thing, and we don't want to really emphasize loyalty. And it's almost at times when we talk about like sports fans, that there is always this sense, even the way that they're portrayed, as though they're a little fanatical. They're a little over the top. They're a little overboard in their devotion. It's admirable, but not necessarily for everyone. And I think that's unfortunately a part of the culture and the air that we breathe, is that we have so many options. Why be anchored down to one, right? And even, unfortunately, even in the sense of within Christianity, there is even now this concept that's starting to peek its head of, and I saw this article in Christianity Today a few years ago, of the rise of polyamorous relationships, even amongst people who claim to be Christian.
Okay.
And that this concept of loyalty, of faithfulness, of I will stick to this decision and live that out thick and thin is a very foreign concept, honestly, in our Western individualistic culture today, because we don't want to feel we are obligated, as though we have no other choice. And that's my initial hot take of what has happened, is that we are maybe possibly so scared of making a wrong choice that we would rather not make any real hard choice at all.
Fair enough. Yep. I hope I've clarified my view on Aman enough for our audience that they know where I'm going with this. That, and here's as blatant as I can be when it comes to a divine counsel worldview. I don't, again, want to divide among those who take a divine counsel worldview and pit one side against the other. That's not my intent. I know that Mike came to his view, Dr. Heiser, of believing loyalty through a path of discussion to himself and, careful thought, just like he was wont to do on so many things. For me, we came, and again, we never talked this one out, but it's funny how we came to the same view. I was sitting in a Perkins, 2 a.m, night after night at this restaurant when I was doing my dissertation. And I think I've told the story here, where I was going through story after story of the ancient world of, Bel and Marduk and El and all this stuff, and reading the prayers and all this stuff to these deities, and the fear that you could feel in the writings of these prayers, talking to a God that you didn't know how they'd react and all this stuff, and hoping that they'd answer your prayers. And then dropping into, and this is all part of my dissertation, dropping into the Psalms and reading David extol the character of his Elohim. It was so stunning to watch that. And I would be in tears sometimes. I've told that story too, where the waitress comes up and says, "Are you okay?" And I was just bawling, because there's this guy at 2 a.m. over coffee bawling. Of course, you're going to be nervous, but no, I said, it's just my dissertation. And all I meant was, I'm meeting Yahweh for the first time the way I think David knew him. Oh man, was it a shock to my system. And I was 40 some years old. Where had I been? I felt so bad that it wasn't my salvation moment, Mike, but it was almost like I met God for the first time because of a divine counsel worldview. And I'm going to be that bold. It was that shocking for me. And I was already saved. I was already loyal to him, but I now met him in the text. And so that's what it was for me. And that's why me and Mike would, we'd email each other and talk, and phone calls about discovering this stuff, not as though it's new, but as though it's 2,000 years old and I should have known it, kind of thing. Here's my point. He called it believing loyalty. Dr. Bates calls it salvation by allegiance alone, uses the word allegiance. I just use the word loyalty. And again, it's just an English word. But to me, it's a loyalty that is a decision of a human in respect to which deity I'm going for, which deity I want, which deity I'm going to stick with. That question, as it's played out in the Old Testament, the use of aman is basically your word. That's your operative word. But here's the problem. Aman is a general word. It's a secular word. It's used, as we just showed, in Genesis 42:20 for the word verify. So it's a very secular term, but when it's used of a human worshiping a deity, it becomes, unfortunately, a religious idea. And I would say, even to my atheist friend, when he would talk about faith as the opposite of evidence, he always thinks of that. So when we would debate, he would talk about my faith as though I'm walking into an empty elevator shaft, hoping it comes up and meets me, the floor. And I say, no, faith is giving loyalty to a deity because I know he is who he says he is. And in other words, it's a completely different definition of a term in English, but it's where we were. So when we come to Genesis 15:6, the reason it's quoted in Romans 4, in Galatians 3, and James 2 is because, and here's again, I don't want to pit sides against each other within our worldview, but for me, a divine counsel worldview means that my salvation itself is dependent on one simple idea. Do I have the right God? Period. And if I have a view of, and here's where we start to divide, just to be honest. Again, this is my schooling, so I've been through this. I've taught it. That doesn't make me right. I'm just saying I've sat in these classes and been part of this world all my life. What usually happens is we get into the New Testament, and Paul becomes our sounding board. Most conversations in justification today, even on faith, will go straight to Paul. They'll give a little bit of time to Old Testament, but hardly any at all. And they'll go right to Paul because he's the guy, he has the Romans road. He's the guy who explains salvation to the average evangelical. I wince when I hear that because I think if Paul were in the audience for the average Christian sermon, he'd maybe approach the pastor, or at least if the pastor asked him, how was my sermon? Paul would shake his head and he'd say, you invented something out of my words that I never intended to say. And what I mean by that is that salvation, or faith now, is faith toward a version of soteriology. If you believe that Jesus is doing this for you, then you can be saved, whatever you want to put in that place. Paul would say, well, I didn't mean to undo the Old Testament story. Lydia got saved because she converted to Jesus. She worshiped the right deity. And the Philippian jailer got saved because he believed in the Lord Jesus Christ. And if you had defined a soteriological theory to him, he would have said whatever. He wasn't worried about that. And yet in our, again, current status, and I talk about this with my friends all the time, they don't think I'm right because I don't pack enough theology into my faith. I say faith means having the right deity. They say, well, it can't just be that. It's got to be a version of soteriology that you believe in. And I say, but that's Paul. Don't do something in the New Testament that he would be himself surprised that we did. Now, again, I've talked a lot, Mike. I've given you plenty of ammunition. So please respond.
I think, this really also does come down to we need to define what do we mean by even the word faith. And, it was a wide opening moment for me last year in one of my classes, one of my last classes at Gordon, as we and the professor were discussing, and we realized that this concept of faith, meaning I mentally believe that Jesus died for my sins. That a lot of times the way that the gospel message is communicated is just simply, do you agree with this statement? Do you mentally agree with this statement? If you do, you're saved. And we make that as the most minimum, most lowest common denominator as possible in our preaching and our teaching. That it is really insulting then, because to look at the Old Testament and to realize, well, it wasn't just simply they mentally believe one thing, but they actually live with that reality in their minds, right? When last time we were talking about Abram going out to rescue Lot, he didn't do like the little mantra prayer of like, oh Yahweh, or El Elyon, please make sure I don't die when I go out to rescue Lot. He just went out there, and through a miraculous feat, with 318 men, brought Lot home in the midst of the aftermath of two giant rival armies fighting with each other, and his little small band of men are able to overcome the larger army. And to me, there's that moment of like, that's his loyalty is being lived out. And he's trusting that I'm not going to die in the midst of this, even though I have a promise from this God that I will have descendants. How will that promise even work out if I die? But he still goes out to save his rescue lot.
Yeah.
And so there's something I think within our culture where the word faith has been so diluted that when we use the word faith and all we're simply saying to people is, do you at least mentally agree? Can you put a little check mark on a little index card so you can put it into the offering basket so that we know, hey, this is how many people who said at least I mentally believe Jesus died for my sins.
Well, one third of American youth, I saw a Gallup poll, at some point in their life have asked Jesus to forgive their sins through his death on the cross. 1/3 of American youth. So if you talk about that mental assent to a theological doctrine, that's where and I'm with you, that my nervousness is, we take a concept that's very simple, worship the right deity, and we've turned it into a assent or believe in a doctrine that doctrine can take you to heaven. See, again, it not only worries me that we've moved the object of our faith, we've redefined faith, and then we've even put in a version of a doctrine as the basis of our faith. And I don't mean to divide our audience into different versions of atonement. I'm saying any view of atonement, if that's your version of faith, nobody in the Old Testament had a version of atonement by which they got saved. Again, if you really want to confuse your pastor, I don't mean to do this, nefariously, but if you really want to confuse your pastor, just say, Pastor, how did people get saved in the Old Testament? And watch. Again, the reason this is going to be tough is because he's not been taught this, and he's going to have to, on his feet, put the whole story of the Bible together in 1 minute. And that's very difficult to do unless you've, spent a lot of time on it. We're not taught that in seminary. We're taught to inspect the gravel on the road, not the road itself, not to look up and see if you're on the right road. And my point is that you can inspect all the gravel you want. If you look up and you don't know why or where this road leads, I'm personally done with that I've got 20 good years left, I think, maybe. And I'm going to spend that time thinking about the road. I've spent a lot of time on the gravel, but I would like to know, how did an Abraham get right with God? That's a good question, right? I think we all can ask that question. How did Abraham get right with God? In fact, let's do this as a mental picture. If I threw a fishing line backwards into Genesis 1, I'm standing in Genesis 15, and I throw a line back into Genesis 1 and start to reel it in, and I'm trying to catch what's the important themes that are going to catch on that hook so that I can bring in the story to Genesis 15:6 and make sense of it. Here's my point. I'll just throw it out there. I don't think I'm going to feel as though, or I'm not going to be dragging in Adamic guilt. I'm not going to be dragging in sin management. I'm not going to be catching forgiveness as an issue. I'm not going to be finding the hope of a savior there, not even the hope of a Messiah. What I'm going to be catching on that hook are things that we have seen in the text, which are basically, which deity are these people worshiping? Again and again, I find, again, maybe people will say that's picking. I would be happy. This would be a wonderful, real coffee moment, over the restaurant table, to get 12 of us together and say, let's each of us have a text in front of us and defend our view of Genesis 1 to 15 in the text by what we're sensing the story to be. And I would argue I'm seeing a Genesis 3, 4, 6, 10, 11, certainly 12, 13. All these chapters have a which God question. They don't have a how do I solve my sin question. So here's my challenge. Why would I turn salvation in the New Testament into a how do I solve my sin question when that was never the opening question of Genesis 1 to 15? What do you think? Am I fair?
I'm just like, as you're talking, I'm thinking, I am a born and bred Bostonian, and yet, I am ethnically 100% Chinese. I have the subculture of being Toysonese, if folks ever even know what that is. It's an old term that most people won't ever recognize, because Toysonese folks were the first ones to come to America from China to help build the intercontinental railroads for the United States. And that's a whole history in itself. But I'm coming from a people and a culture where pagan worship, even worship of your own family members, in some sense, of like your deceased loved ones. There's little altars that we would have at times in homes where we would do some sort of little offering. If we're not Christian, right? The assumption is if we're not Christian, you would typically see in a lot of these homes like these little pictures or little altars, places where they can put a little, like Chinese bread or something like that to remember their loved one. And they're hoping that their loved one is like, can you help me out in the spiritual world? And so like I'm coming from that kind of perspective where there's a lot of rivals to Jesus. And that one of the difficulties in convincing, folks who are from like an Asian background where the worship of so many deities is just plain as day, is just normal part of our existence, that you got to convince a person from that kind of background, drop the worship of the God of money, drop the worship of the God of health, drop the worship of even your family members that you dearly love, your grandma and your grandfather, that you've been thinking, I'm taking care of them in the afterlife by giving them some paper money and food. Drop all that and lay down your full loyalty and allegiance to this God named Jesus. It's a hard sell. And it amazes me every time I see it that folks will actually, yes, I will forfeit all these things. And the most common stories I heard when I grew up in the Chinese Heritage Church that I became a Christian in was of people who came from a really pagan background. They had little altars in their home for their family members. And one of the first acts of worship that they would do after becoming Christian is they would go to these very altars of precious family members.
Right.
And chuck them into the trash.
Oh my. Yeah. Well, that's
that
conversion
for them was like this. Yeah. This is how important this is. That even when it looks to my neighbors that I am being a terrible grandson, a terrible great grandson of my family, I'm throwing out the pictures. I'm throwing out the altars of my family members. Of how disrespectful that is, how shameful that must be, and yet that was how deeply convinced they were that Jesus is the God of all creation that they need to worship. And I think
that'd be hard if I was schooled on that and I had that in my own house. And again, I told the story of the Indian lady that came and had supper with us, and she told about that idol in her kitchen that they give food to every morning back in India. How hard it would be to break the cycle of tribal generational worship of another deity, including a family member, and say Jesus is enough. And yet that's exactly what I think is happening in the Bible. So as simple as, writing a card, and let's thank the Lord for how you and I probably came to, I came to Jesus, came to God. I came to my Christian faith, in fact, by raising my hand in camp when I was 5 and asking Jesus to forgive my sins. Did I get saved that day? I think by all definitions, yes. Now, the question, of course, by any standard would be, did I continue to worship Jesus after that 5-year-old moment? And the answer is yes. Same for you. I'm sure your conversion had a moment that may not have, doesn't come by the standard of what we're talking here. But the idea of biblical, getting into the text, realizing what they did to get saved, I would hope that the average reader, listener, can say that in Genesis 15:6, based on the text, that all he did was convert to the worship of the proper deity, and that alone accounted his righteousness. And everything that's going to be built on that word righteous, including Psalm 1:6, the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly will perish. That the great division of mankind between wicked and righteous is based on the which deity question, and that settles it. So that as we move forward from here, again, here's my challenge to the listener in our podcast, is wait for anyone in the biblical record to change that up. Will at any point, will the expectation of a Messiah change that? Will the sacrificial system change? But, we're 500 years away from a sacrificial system. We have sacrifices going on here, but the system under Moses won't happen for 500 more years. So, and I remember getting in huge trouble in seminary for this. I forget where I was in the sense of what class I brought it up in. I could tell you the teacher, He's a world-renowned theologian. And I remember saying something like this. I'll paraphrase one of my questions. Seminary, how it works. There's only a dozen of you, and you're talking all the time. And so during one of those conversations, I said, isn't the fact that the righteousness of Abraham happened 500 years before the sacrificial system even got going, evidence that the sacrificial system has nothing to do with becoming righteous? You would have thought a bomb went off. I was like, how dare, he didn't say this, but I could tell by his eyes. It was like, how dare you undo the Reformed doctrine of sacrifice leading to the sacrifice of Jesus. That whole story of how the sacrifices were made for us to have the final sacrifice in Jesus, whatever. And I knew he had that view, but I was just kind of saying an obvious point of, whoa, stop the story a second. Let me catch on what you mean here. If people were getting righteous well before Moses, then we've got to have a system whereby God counts people righteous outside of that system. Can you explain that? And I remember him just wanting to get around, I forget what he said, but I could tell he just wanted to get around the whole question because it didn't fit the model of the soteriology he had coming out the other end. So that this is part of my memory, Mike. I'm replaying all these painful situations in front of you, but that's why I'm where I am.
And I think I want to bring up just, the fact that I'm bringing up my own cultural or ethnic kind of background. I think, especially in a Western mindset where, one of my first New Testament professors, he said it very plainly that in reality, Christianity for the longest time did win the battle of the gods. And that Western civilization has gone on for so long without this kind of, regular concept that there are so many other rival loves to the worship of Jesus. And the sad thing is that I've been thinking about this for the past couple of months, is that we are getting closer and closer, and especially in my region in the Northeast, where the worship of maybe a particular ideology or a particular philosophy, and ironically even now the worship of pagan deities that used to be associated with certain people groups, are starting to come back up and are rising again. And when we say that righteousness is associated to the loyalty that you're giving to a particular deity, to a particular God, it seems like almost like, yes, the response is like, well, that just seems too simple. It's like, no, it's not.
Yeah, that's usually the response I get, is that's much too simple for the story.
And in reality, it isn't, because everything that I had just mentioned about my cultural and ethnic background of people who are completely not Christian, never grew up in the church, and for them to, one of their first acts of worship is to destroy a family altar, something that is supposed to signal to your community and to your family of how good of a son you are, how good of a child you are to this family. That's a high cost. And to say oh, you got to do more. It's how much more do you want to show that the person has really made a life-altering shift in their loyalty to and their worship to another deity, in this case, to Jesus.
Yeah. I can hear the listeners say, because I've had this conversation for many years with my friends, yeah, but Jesus and especially Paul had more information. So the story of salvation, this is a Reformed doctrine that I grew up on and I taught for many years, is that Paul even knew more than Jesus about the story, because he was an apostle who was given through the mind of the Spirit an understanding of the trajectory of revelation, so that in their mind, this is the Reformer speaking, and again, I welcome them into this conversation because I want to understand how I used to think, right? That Abraham knew this much, and the story, has a trajectory up. And by the time you get to Paul, we have an understanding of atonement that is much further along than Abraham had, and therefore it, shall we say, trumps it. It usurps and even replaces a very simple doctrine of just believing in the right deity. Now we have, and I'm speaking again as the Reformer, a system, an actual theological system whereby God needed something to happen. He got it done through Jesus. And I'm really making it sound mechanical now, but The requirement of perfection was satisfied in the life of Jesus, and Jesus' death did this, that, and the other, could be thus in that model the means by which people are saved. Whereas the concept of faith can still be simple, but the means now is much more complex even. It includes an atonement theory and all the rest. I'm saying back to that idea, go ahead and do that with your Pauline doctrines or whatever you want to call them, but don't change the story. Don't change the means by which a person can throw themselves down in the middle of a field in the middle of Nebraska who knows nothing about atonement theory and simply say, God, Yahweh, I love you. If your doctrine of salvation doesn't allow for the simple doctrine of Abraham's faith to a deity, when he was still a minority deity and there were a lot of options, and he chose that one, not another one, that if that's the story there, and Paul quotes it several times in Romans, verbatim, that Abraham believed God and was accounted for righteousness, that Paul is content to still grab the same story and use it in his doctrine of the Romans road. Doesn't it mean, here's again, I'm talking to my Reformed friend, doesn't it imply that salvation itself is still the simple idea of which God? And if you want to pack on, ideas around it, go ahead. But Paul himself would be the one, in my version here, to pull you back from saying that object of faith has to be a doctrinal statement. I think Paul himself would say, don't labor the pieces of the puzzle and fit them into a doctrine of soteriology so that the doctrine itself is what you're believing in. That's my burden.
Ron, I guess maybe I'll throw this as an open question to you and maybe to the audience. But the sense that I get, right, the way that you're describing it seems to me that there's a discomfort with a process of discipleship, a process of growth, right? Because as we started reading about Abram, he started out as just a regular pagan. Mm-hmm. He started out with, I remember when you mentioned about how the way that Yahweh came to Abram is reminiscent of how other deities would initiate some sort of relationship with a human being.
Right.
And that was an accommodation. That was like, okay, you understand life up to this point. I'm going to work with what I have, with the tools and resources that are available. I'm just going to somehow communicate to you, because that's actually what's more important, communication and getting my idea across. Like, to me, like there is, it's almost like this fear that, well, we can't have it be that simple, because what if they stay there for the rest of their lives, that they never move beyond, well, it's like, I just need to just trust in the right deity. And there's almost this kind of, I don't know, I almost want to say this cynical belief that is like, well, we just have to at least get people across the line. Let's get them across the line. And then whatever happens to them, if they're good disciples or not, if they're really faithful followers of Jesus, that's not our problem. Almost. It's like our job is just to get you across the line. Yeah,
well, it's a good question. What's the most important thing? Get people to heaven. I've grown up on that. The most important decision you'll ever make is, and we use the get saved line. Yep.
And I think maybe partly my theology over the maybe past decade and a half has been shaped and really just rocked by the realization that, like, the Great Commission, the very words Jesus said in the end of Matthew, that the only verb, the real active verb, is make disciples.
Right.
And that everything else that looks like a verb in our English is a participle. It's describing the main action verb, which is make disciples. And making disciples is not a snap your finger transformation moment. All of a sudden you have now the 100% perfect Christian.
Right.
It's a lifetime process. And so, like, to me, it's like we have to start from the first building block, which is, which God are you worshiping? And before we can even move on to anything else, unless that question is resolved, we can't build on anything else after that. And
of course, the quick answer I've heard even to that is, well, don't all Americans worship Yahweh? In God we trust is on our money. So obviously we worship. And most, if you're from Ukraine you think of Americans as worshiping God, as opposed to, well, let's use a different country. China. Don't Chinamen think that Americans worship Yahweh? I would think they would suspect that. But if you knew anything about what names of the gods are up there, you would, because they're Christian, Americans are Christian, therefore they worship the God of the Bible, and that God's name is Yahweh, right? Is that how they would think?
Well, I think, I'm not sure exactly about China, because I think the atheism within the Communist Party has like so spread across that people are not even aware. Really, there's more like, capitalism is our God in America, or what they would claim. But I think in Nepal, where I have been a few times, that is the assumption. America is a Christian nation. Okay. And thus you worship Jesus.
And the same, so let me push my question then, or my application. In the same way that Abraham's family, and we can stay in Genesis for this, does Abraham's family worship Yahweh? The answer is yes and no. There's going to be an Ishmael. There's going to be an Esau. There's going to be people within the story who reject Yahweh. And the story, I think, will bear this out, and yet their brother, Isaac and Jacob, will choose Yahweh. And I think the story can be understood that way. And again, we have to get there to show that. But the point is that we can say a Christian nation may not all be Christians. Fair enough. I think we all know that just being in America doesn't make you a Christian. The same way you can be Jewish or have Abrahamic blood and not be a true Jew, according to Paul, because, a true Jew doesn't have to be circumcised, or remember that Romans 2 argument. So the point is that when we talk tribalism, whether it be America today or Judaism then, we know based upon the story of Scripture, that's why one of my main points a couple podcasts ago was it's an individual call. God will bring people to the question outside of their race or their tribe. He's going to ask them individually, which God you worship. So I would say in America, it's very common for people to say they believe in God, go to church, pray the prayer, whatever, and from Monday to Saturday, not really worship Yahweh at all. And again, God knows the heart. Obviously, I'm not making claims here that I can't, or I'm not saying I can judge this, but the biblical story that I'm reading is one of where people can play the game out, outwardly for political reasons, for family reasons, whatever, and never equate that to an individual walk with their Creator. So my appeal to anyone, and as we close this podcast, we didn't get very far in the first 6 verses of 15. But let me summarize. In fact, the reason we took this time, I trust, and it wasn't wasted time, is to think, about the definition of faith. What do we mean by that English word that has just lost, even in the last, 30, 40, 50 years, its meaning? Back in the old day, I remember these weddings, Mike, I went to them, and we would say, unto thee I betroth my faith. That was the actual promise. Unto thee I betroth my faith. Why would we use the word faith to mean faithfulness in the 60s? And now we mean it, completely different way today in this day. So that's number one. We've lost the meaning of an English word. Number two, that falls now into theological discussions, because even good seminary trained theologians are coming out of seminary with a word faith that they want to separate from faithfulness. And I would argue that in the text itself of the Old Testament, we have the basis of a word that does not mean faith. It means faithfulness, and it always meant it. And so the argument of what faith means, I think, could be as simple as clicking on your buttons in Accordance or Logos and watching the word get translated literally across the Old Testament. Then, number three, when you get to the New Testament, be loath to ever change the story. We better have good evidence that we're going to change the Abrahamic 15:6 of Genesis into something else. And if we have that, well, let's go with it. But I don't find Paul ever trying to undo Genesis 15:6. He's basing his entire theology on it. And he's telling Lydia this, the Philippian jailer this, and all the people he meets. This is how you get saved. You switch your worship from the deities of the Roman pantheon, wherever you are in the Galatian world or the European world, and you believe in a Nazarene who died and rose and ascended to the right hand of the Father. That's the person you're giving your faith to. In that story, yes, there's going to be atonement theory. I understand that, but that's not the basis of your salvation. So This was an hour given to one idea alone. And to me, though, it's 15.6. And by the time you get to 15.6, you better have in your head where you're going with it, because the rest of the story will depend on how you settle in on 15.6. Fair enough?
And I think also, just to clarify, right, for the audience, right, is that when you mention folks like Esau or Lot or whoever, like that, these people maybe they had given their loyalty to another god, but that doesn't mean that they no longer thought that Yahweh existed, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's sometimes people also make this weird assumption that it's like that these other gods, these other deities, that they were non-entities, and the reality is like Yahweh can still exist. To say that we don't have faithfulness or loyalty to Yahweh does not mean he no longer exists. It really is that it's actually, I have made the choice to not follow, to not be loyal to this God named Yahweh. And so that folks like Cain or Esau or whoever over the time as we read, they are not, like, we have to wonder, like they probably will surely acknowledge Yahweh exists. I've seen his power. I've seen the fact that my forefathers, our shared forefathers like Abraham, have made it this far, and he attributed it to Yahweh. But I think I'm a little bit more enamored with this other God.
Yep.
But it isn't to say that Yahweh doesn't exist.
Yeah. Can I quote from a New Testament passage again that is so misunderstood? No temptation has overtaken you, except which is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted above what you are able. But with the temptation, make a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. Paul's warning was the temptation of walking to church every Saturday night and walking by idols in the marketplace. You're going to be so tempted to worship those deities. I know you are. Because Jesus is not an idol, and he was crucified. You've got all these these ideas of a savior that don't work in the religious world of that time period. And you're going to go worship him in that house on Main Street up there. And the temptation to give in to other deities is so strong. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. So all I'm bringing that up is that we often take that verse about temptation as, it's money and cars and sex. Paul was saying, guys, this is a demon issue. This is a God issue. It's a witch God question. Again, I'm maybe overseeing it, so I'll be happy to take the complaint that he sees gods on every page. I had a teacher say that about me to some other student at college. He sees gods everywhere, and he didn't like it. And I said, I know. Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview Podcast. The gods are everywhere, and turn a page and try not to find them. That's the scary thing. So I've said it enough, and so I think we should call it a day, even though we've only gotten through 6 verses. But again, to me, you got to figure out what 15.6 means and be ready to settle in on it and take that string, that magical fishing line, and hook it in 15.6 and be willing to pull it through the rest of your Old Testament and then into the New and see where it takes you. So that's what we did. Good to go?
I think so.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being part of it, and we'll see you next time.